Welcome to Dublin Castle. Today we're going to travel back in time to the 12th century to meet a Norman knight by the name of Strongbow. Strongbow is known as one of the knights, the Norman knights who came to Ireland at the beginning of the Norman conquest. He wasn't the only Norman knight that came, but I guess he's the most well known. So to make this little book about Strongbow's life, you're going to need a few materials. You're going to need the printout of the 3 pages in which all the drawings are done. So again, with the drawings, you can cut them out and stick them on yourself, or you can draw them yourself. You'll see many of the drawings are done as stickmen, and they're quite fun. You can actually do that yourself. You will also need 2 pieces of card, one for the front and one for the back of your book. I think these are quite fun. Or otherwise you can colour it in or use coloured paper yourself. I suggest that you cut out all of the little figures first at the beginning so that you can just work straight through the project and figures like this little one here, which is King Henry II. You also need a selection of markers, pens, a little ruler is very handy because this helps us to flatten out the book as we do it, a scissors obviously for cutting out, and a Pritt stick for sticking. So we're going to start by making the little book itself. And so what we need is a piece of A3 paper, just ordinary photocopying, light paper will do, nothing special there, and we need to fold it 3 times in half. So this is the first fold, and what we do is we get our ruler and we just run it along the fold like that, and that gives us a nice sharp bend. Then we fold it a second time like this, and again we take our ruler and we go along the edge like that and across the bottom. That's 2 folds, and then we do a 3rd fold, so it's down to this size. And again we'll take our ruler and just go along the edge there like that, and that gives us a nice flat edge to work on. So this is what we have now. So what we need to do next to create the book out of it is just to open up the page once again so that it's sitting like this. So you can see that's flat and there's a nice ridge there, and it's this little line here that we need to cut, this little line here. So we take the scissors and we just cut only as far as there. See that? And so then we find we have our paper, and it's a bit like a beak. See that? So you fold it in half this way, and then you do that, push it up so it becomes flat, and you fold it this way. Just press it down, so it's a nice little book shape. And then you fold it a 3rd time. So again, it's like this, and this is your book shape. So inside the book, here's one I made earlier. We have the front page, which is our front cover. We tell the first part of the story here about how Strongbow arrives. The second part of the story, what happens when he's here. And the 3rd part of the story is when King Henry II arrives. And then we finish up at the end with what happened in the end with Strongbow's life. So Strongbow came here in 1170 and actually only spent 6 years here, but they were 6 very important years. So we're going to start now with the first page, and I'm going to take my piece of blue card, a little bit of Pritt stick or whatever glue you've got, and just glue it on like this, and we're going to pop it on there on the front page. So that's our front page. Now, but this book is about Strongbow, so we're going to have our first little picture of Strongbow here. And again, you can draw this one any way you wish, or you can use the one that has been provided. This little drawing that I did of Strongbow is based on one that he had during his lifetime. So that gives us a sense of what he was like as a picture. There we go. So we do know about Strongbow. We know little bits about him because there was a historian at the time called Gerald of Wales, and he wrote about the Normans in Ireland at the time it was happening, and he was there. He saw the people and he met them. And he describes Strongbow, interestingly enough, as tall, generous, courteous, confident, and not puffed up by success. So it just gives you a sense of his personality. So we're going to write his name now. Get the right pen. So on this one here, I'm going to write his name on the top, and he was called Strongbow. We know him as Strongbow. But what's interesting about that is that he was probably not called Strongbow during his lifetime. That was a name that was used for him when people were writing about him after he had died. But his real name was, the thing he would have been called at the time, was Richard Fitzgilbert de Clare. So I'm going to write that also on the front. So you have the full picture. Fitzgilbert de Clare. And there's the front cover of our book that tells us what we know him as now and what he was called then. So let's see what happened in his life. So the year that we're talking about here is 1170, and that's when 1169, 1170, that's when our action is happening. So we're going to set the scene by putting, this is a little part of Ireland, a little corner of Ireland, the southeast corner of Ireland. It's called Leinster, and we're going to glue Leinster onto this side of our page, like this, because these are the two important bits of the story. And then this is Wales. We're going to put Wales on the other side. And we can see we've got some of the characters already drawn in. So we're going to pop Wales in on this side. So there we go. There's Leinster, there's Wales. So the important character in relation to Leinster was Dermot MacMurrough, and this is a little drawing that I've done of Dermot MacMurrough. He was an Irish king. He'd been involved in battles with other Irish kings, and he had lost, basically. And his punishment was that his lands would be taken and he was exiled, which meant he had to go and live outside Ireland. He wasn't allowed to live in his own territory. So he travelled around Wales and England and France looking for people to help him to get his land back. So the important time for us to think about is when he was in Bristol, which is in the south of England. And when he was in Bristol, Dermot MacMurrough, who was travelling with his wife and his daughter Aoife, they met the knight Strongbow. And Dermot told Strongbow all about his situation, and he asked him to help him get his land back. And Strongbow said yes he would. So that's a sort of an important conversation, so let's pop that in. I'm going to put in here, will you help me get my land back? So there's Dermot MacMurrough asking would he help him get his land back, and then Strongbow says okay. Now he probably didn't say okay, but we're just shortening it to appear there. So Strongbow was living in Wales at the time. He lived in a place called Chepstow Castle. And when he agreed with Dermot MacMurrough to go to Ireland, he had to assemble a large army. So he went back to his castle and he rounded up about 1,200 knights and soldiers and attendants and horses. And so we're just going to pop them in. We're going to pop them in here. There we go, so we can see them. And so when he had his army assembled, he decided he would sail out of a town called Milford Haven, because that was very handy for getting to Ireland. So we have his army here marching across the south of Wales and going to Milford Haven. So then he needed to make the sea journey across to Ireland. So let's draw in the sea and let's draw in his ships. So I like to draw in the sea with two colours because the sea doesn't really just have one colour. And again, you can do this in your own time. So I like to use two different blues to do this because I think it is. So there we go. So Strongbow wasn't the only Norman knight to go to Ireland. There were 3 or 4 other major important knights that actually had gone to Ireland ahead of him. But we talk about Strongbow, I guess, because he's the most well known. So here we go. He's now facing his sea journey. So we just pop in a few boats for him because you need your boats. Back then, sea journeys in the 12th century, sea journeys were always very tricky and very weather dependent. And if a storm blew up, you would have to wait until the storm passed. So he heads out anyway across the Irish Sea to Ireland in his boats, his fleet of boats, 1,200 strong army. and there he is. He's sailing across to Ireland. So he landed very near to Waterford in a place called Passage East. Some of you might be familiar with it. And from Passage East he marched to Waterford on the 25th of August 1170. And when he arrived at Waterford, what he wanted to do was to attack it and take control of the city. So we're just going to stick in a few of the Norman soldiers, just to show that there was a battle here. We have another one here. I'm just going to mark Waterford. So, here we go. Strongbow has arrived at Waterford. His soldiers attack it and they take control of Waterford. Waterford at the time, like many towns, had a wall all the way around it. But the Normans were very clever soldiers and they spotted a weakness in the way that the wall was constructed. And they pushed hard at that weakness, and this was how they managed to get control of Waterford. So the plan was, once they had Waterford, their next plan was that they would march on Dublin. So Dermot MacMurrough and Strongbow's armies joined together. But before they actually did that, Dermot MacMurrough, back in Bristol, had promised Strongbow that if he came and helped him to get his land back, that Strongbow could marry his daughter Aoife. And the deal was that Strongbow, would then become Dermot's heir, so that when Dermot died, Strongbow gets to control all of Leinster. Now that was quite a good deal, because around this time we think Dermot MacMurrough was about 70 years old, and that was very old for the time. Most people, if they lived to 50, were doing well. So in a sense, Strongbow had an expectation. He knew that Dermot was probably going to die soon enough, and that he would then get to control all of Leinster. So the next stage of our story is that Strongbow married Dermot MacMurrough's daughter Aoife. So that then gives him this very important position in relation to Leinster. So we just get a little picture there. So I've made this little sketch here of Strongbow and Aoife getting married. At the time, Strongbow was about 40, and we think that Aoife was about 17, which seems quite a big age gap. But there was a tradition among families at that time, particular families that were powerful, that had land. They would get their children to marry people that would improve the positions of those families. So it wasn't unusual that somebody like Aoife didn't get to choose who she married. The deal was done by her father. So we're going to stick in the marriage. There you go. You might like to decorate that when you're working on it yourself. So what happened next after they got married? Dermot MacMurrough and Strongbow decided to march to Dublin, because Dublin was a very important city at the time and they really wanted to get control of that. So we're going to just draw in the march to Dublin. Now the thing about the march to Dublin, what's interesting about that is that most people, if they were marching from Waterford to Dublin, would have gone along the west side of the mountains where County Carlow is today. But Strongbow and Dermot MacMurrough had heard that the big army of Rory O'Connor was waiting for them on the west side of Dublin. So they took a slightly risky route, and they decided they would march over the hills, over the Wicklow Mountains, and get to Dublin in the most direct but slightly dangerous and tricky way. So let's just stick on all of our little knights there. These ones I've put on horseback because speeds up their journey. Wicklow at the time, there were not many people living in Wicklow at that time. There was very few roads. It was mainly just tracks over the mountains, and it was a difficult place to trek through and to bring a full army through, you can imagine, with all of their equipment and their soldiers. But they thought it was worth the risk going that way, because they could surprise Dublin. They could arrive at Dublin unexpectedly. I just finished putting them in there. Yeah. So this is the army here, and they're marching on Dublin. And they arrive at the walls of Dublin. So I've only drawn a small section of the wall here you can see it. This is the wall. It would have had a fence on the top and some of the buildings that were on the inside. And again, when you're doing your book, you can colour all of this in. So we're going to stick in Dublin. There we go. So this is Dublin. And what happened when they arrived at Dublin was that Dermot MacMurrough started to negotiate with the people who were controlling Dublin at the time, because they were very worried when they saw Strongbow's army arriving, because it was really, really big by their standards. And a deal was done between Dermot MacMurrough and the people of Dublin that they would leave Dublin alone. They would own it effectively, but they would really leave it alone. Now, the problem with that was that the Normans had come to Ireland and they didn't want to make peace deals or treaties or anything. They really just wanted to take control of the land. They were there for a reason. And so even though Dermot MacMurrough had done a deal with Dublin through the Archbishop, they decided not to pay any attention to that and to go on and attack Dublin themselves. And so they did. So there we go. So now we've got some of the army in here and they're attacking Dublin. And again, they're very good soldiers. They found this nice weakness and they're able to push in and take control of Dublin. The people of Dublin were amazed and shocked at the time because they believed a peace treaty had been done, but the Normans didn't honour it, and they went ahead in and they took control of Dublin. So we then find that here's our Strongbow. He is now in control of Dublin. Here we go. We just put him in there. Put him up there on top. Now, again, you can decorate these pages as you go. So now we find that Strongbow and the Normans are in control of Dublin. So not long, within 6 months of all of this happening, Dermot MacMurrough died. Strongbow then becomes the ruler of Leinster. So Strongbow is a fairly clever guy, and he knows if he says, I am a king in Ireland, that his king, Henry II in England, will be very upset about this and very worried about it. And so instead of making himself king of Leinster, he then goes back to Henry II in England and he says to Henry, I will give you all the lands that I have taken control of in Ireland and they will be yours. So King Henry II, who then came to Ireland, and what he did, we're going to actually put in Ireland now. So there's Ireland. Let's pop that in. I'm going to put the C around it because obviously Ireland is an island. So let's put in some C. So King Henry II then sets out for Ireland. And obviously he is interested in owning Ireland and having the conquest. Henry II already controlled England at that point, large parts of Wales, Normandy in the north of France, Aquitaine in France, and other parts of western France. So he was a very powerful man at that time. And when he came to Ireland in 1171, he brought a massive army with him, of about 5,000 people, which was very large by those standards. And so we have a picture of him here. Here he is on his boat and he's sailing to Ireland. So the reason he came to Ireland was really to take possession of the lands that Strongbow had said he could have, but then he wanted to divide up those lands between his own Norman supporters. So what he did was he granted Strongbow back the areas around Leinster. He gave Dublin to Hugh de Lacy along with Meath, and Waterford and Wexford he also allocated to other people. And the reason he did that was he was still a bit worried about Strongbow, who had gone off to conquer these lands on his own. And I think reading about King Henry II, I don't think King Henry II ever really trusted Strongbow because of things that had happened in their history 20 years before. So anyway, we have Henry II here arriving with his massive army. So here we go. So although when Henry II arrived, the Normans mainly controlled these southern parts, there were other kings in Ireland who were looking at this massive army arriving and they were worried about their position. So Henry II arrives. Now, one of the interesting things that Henry II does when he arrives is he appoints a representative, a king's representative for Ireland. We later know them as Lord Lieutenants, Lord Deputies, or Viceroys. And the English monarchs, the kings and queens of England, continued to send representatives to Ireland from 1171 right up until the beginning of 1922. And we're going to come to the 1922 end of the story in a later video. So this is Henry II anyway. He arrives, he spends 6 months in Ireland, and he goes back to England, satisfied that the Normans have taken control of large parts of Ireland. So if we come back to Strongbow, what happened to Strongbow then? So Strongbow then lived on in Ireland. He controlled Leinster. He went off to fight for King Henry II at a later stage and then returned to Ireland with his knights. But Strongbow himself died in he died in 1176. So in all, he'd only spent about 6 years in Ireland, although he had a very important influence here. So for the back page of our book, we're going to put our little bit of a green cover at the back. Then you can choose any colour you like. I just happen to have these cards to hand. And Strongbow when he died on the 20th of April in 1176, he was buried in Christchurch Cathedral. And his tomb is still there today. So if you visit Christchurch Cathedral, and I've done a small little drawing of that tomb. So we're going to pop that in. But again, you can commemorate him in any way you feel like it. So we're going to pop his tomb in there. And I'm going to get a pen and put the very end of his life in. So, Strongbow. He died on the 20th of April, 1176. Now they say he died of an infection in his leg, and it's one of those things that if you or I got an infection today, we would have antibiotics and other medicines to try and treat it and not to allow the infection to spread. But at that time in 1176, they didn't have that kind of medication. So it was a simple enough thing that actually killed him in the end. And that was in 1176. And he's buried in Christchurch Cathedral. And you can see that today, which is great to see. Cathedral. There we go. So he died in 1176 and he's buried in Christchurch Cathedral, and his tomb is still there today, so you can actually go and see that. So when he died, he had been married for 6 years to Aoife, and they had a son, Gilbert, and they had a daughter right here, Isabel. There we go. We're going to pop these two in because that's often nice to know about someone's family. So his son Gilbert unfortunately died as a child, didn't make it into adulthood, but his daughter Isabel inherited his lands in Wales and went on to marry a very interesting Norman called William Marshall. But that's a story for another day. We can talk about that. So this is how Strongbow's life finishes. And here we are over 850 years later, and people still know and talk about Strongbow. And I guess the reason is that whilst he wasn't the only Norman to come during the Norman conquest, he was probably the most well known. So I hope you enjoy making that book and make your own versions of it. Thank you.